I was thinking last night, what are the things that, if you just boil it down to what really made it happen, what really were the things that were key? It comes down to a couple areas, and one of which is that better is the enemy of good enough. That very trite phrase, but there was such an important thought that we are great engineers, we're very professional, we're used to doing a lot of human spaceflight, and if you can do another analysis or if you do another test, we typically try and do that. That's our culture. Because you always ask yourself, is there anything else I could do to make sure this is safe? If someone says yes, you say, okay, well, go do it as long as it's practical. For our flight test being unmanned, we didn't take that approach. There are many things where people said, is there anything else we could do? And they said yes, and we said, okay, but we're not going to do that. We're going to draw the line because this really is good enough. Anything beyond that, then I'll take the risk that it may fail. So you don't have to worry about it. It's not your fault. It's my fault. But this is good enough for us to move forward. So that better is the enemy of good enough really was the mantra that we try to instill upon the managers and the lower level managers within 1X. Of this is all you really need for a flight test, and it's okay if there's a possibility that it won't work. We're not looking for an absolute certainty that we're going to be successful. It's just not practical for the time that we have and for the flight tests that we're putting together. After a while, you can train your team to understand that part of it. Understand, okay, if they see enough examples of their managers, the IPT lead saying, no, we're not going to do that. This is good enough. The people tend to get it. The challenge is that we matrix in engineering support. So people will work in a branch or a division, and they're assigned to a particular project. So they'll be assigned to 1X. And their IPT lead may say, okay, you want to do this test, this analysis. Sorry, we don't need to go do this. This is good enough. They go back to their true supervisor, the person who signs their time card, and says, hey, I want to do so-and-so. The IPT lead or the project manager didn't want to go do that, so we're not doing it. Well, the branch chief or division chief, who's not part of the day-to-day 1X, say, well, wait a minute. Of course we're going to do that. We always do that. We always do this kind of certification. We always do this kind of pyro testing. We always do this area over here. And that creates this, this healthy tension is a word people like to use. But the fact that you can't educate everyone on your team because your team within NASA is never just a team people that you see. It's matrix support beyond, back to the institutions, back to the engineering directors, back through the centers. Those are the ones that that are really going to have a lot of influence on what happens. And so it's a challenge. It's a daily challenge every day to figure out what is good enough versus what is better. So you just got to try and as a project manager do your best and make those calls as to what's good enough and why is it good enough, and go from there.
For a test vehicle, you really try to get people to understand the risk of a test and buy into that early. We did that, we thought, very well in our communication and all. As we moved forward, though, other people got involved that were not involved early on in the buy-in. When you have stakeholder change-out, you've got to get that re-buy-in, and a lot of that happened near the end for us. With our administrator that started our project, he was very adamant that we were a test and how we went forward. As things changed, that communication didn't get brought forward as strongly. So that's something, always remind people, you're a test. You're learning something, whether you're 100% successful or 50% successful, you're learning something by the test. It's better to learn it as a test vehicle than it is an operational vehicle.
With regards to the better being the enemy of the good enough, within the team, we were constantly preached that. And as I indicated, me and the other deputy mission manager, we got that. So those at the top, we got it. The team started getting it. What you see is Ares 1X, while just being a flight test, normally you wouldn't think that's a big deal. But in typical NASA fashion, our test rocket is, oh, by the way, the largest rocket in the world. It's going to get a lot of visibility. So as we're going along, while the core team gets, the better is the enemy of the good enough kind of thing, the external forces, the people back at the centers who aren't involved with us day to day, they're very worried. They see us, in their opinion, short-circuiting process and not following all the guidelines and all the standards and requirements. That's what they're seeing. And they're, I wouldn't go so far as to call it panicking, but they're getting very concerned and the way they see us going about our business. We get it. So we have to communicate up and out to them. And that was what we saw on numerous occasions. We would, especially when the mission manager would go to the Constellation Control Board, he would have an opportunity to outbrief people on why we were doing something, and very often they would ask questions. But you still had folks at the centers, and you saw this coming out of, actually, out of our first stage folks at Marshall. I think they're the ones who expressed the most concerns, and also along with the avionics folks there. They were the most concerned because they have, they're the first stage. They're the part that can explode the most, if you will. They're the most concerned. So they are the ones who are trying to put, their imprint on what we're doing because they're concerned we're not following good enough process. They think we can do better. And yes, we can do better. We can do more. I would tell you, I don't think we can do better. We could have done more. So we're getting it, having to communicate up and out to those folks, get them on board with the concept of this being a flight test, not a human space flight. Better is the enemy of the good enough. Getting that word out was very, very tough, and we had to work at it every day.
Each of us, every member, was very perfectionist, wanted everything just as good as it could be, better, of course. And so it took all levels, in my case, from the IPT lead down through some of my box leads, to try to keep that in rein. Anytime someone saw something they could improve, they'd want to, and going back to the schedule was a large driver for us, and if we had an adequate answer within that time, we just had to call it and say that was it.
The other thing that goes with this is, as engineers, we're always trying to improve, right? We get into engineering things, and sometimes that doesn't always help it, because if it's something if it's a tool or an item that's making things simpler, that's good. But a lot of times, as we try to add, as we try to engineer some of these tools, we try to make them, this would be a really cool idea if it could go do this. Well, that coolness ends up being a little more complex than what we're really ready to bite off when it's a short time frame.
And in many cases, we were just trying to add some additional rationale, or somebody from the chief engineer or the chief safety community or the system engineering organization wanted to see another analysis so that they could feel like all of the what-if questions were being answered. And so we'd go back and we'd work it another 2 or 4 weeks, do some more analyses. And particularly during 2009, as after the hardware was already at KSC, we were, at that point, we had rolled off most of our engineering staff off the project, and they had been assigned to work other projects at Glint. So we had several cases where we had to try to claw back people who had that knowledge or who had done the basic design analysis and written the report, and get them to recrank some numbers for us because somebody was asking for it somewhere out there in the hierarchy of review panels. And so and that would then drive cost. So we needed $7 million of additional budget out of reserves in fiscal 09, and a good chunk of that was driven by by this kind of in my view setting the bar too high and applying a human spaceflight standard to what was an uncrewed initial ascent development test flight.
As far as actual risk for our project, those were done at we kept the scoring the same way the main line did. There were times where it would have been good as a test. You should have rated our risk lower than you would an overall project. But the way we were pretty much held almost like an independent project. So a lot of our risk ended up scoring higher than what you probably would for just a test. We were the first test flight for the new vehicle, so that made a huge impact for the agency. So the risk posture was a lot tighter than what you would if we were, say, the 6th or 7th. We had to fly and we had to work. Early on, we were treated like a test, and as we got closer, as we got more real to people, we really were treated almost like it was a vehicle who had to fly, almost like we were dealing with the human rating. Even though we weren't, we had to work. That was the pressure that was being felt by the team. We had to be successful. There was not an option. Typically on a test, you accept a percentage of failure because you learn something from failure. We couldn't have a failure. We did have, at the end, one of our objectives, we did have the chutes fail, but it was not all of them. We ended up coming down 1.5, so the vehicle came down a little harder. We were able to recover the vehicle. It's sitting down in Kennedy right now, so we didn't actually lose any of our objectives. But normally on a test, you expect that because you learn something from the test. But we were really pushed to not have failure.
Better is the enemy of the good enough. That's probably an overly used phrase now, might even be called trite. But it's not, because people don't learn that lesson. Within NASA, our culture is test. Can I do something more? And that's very understandable. We are in a high visibility business. Everything we do gets a lot of press. And it tends to be negative because people would that's just more interesting. Successes tend not to be as exciting for people as when you see a failure and then you see all the ramifications that come from that. But we have to be very smart about deciding what is good enough, especially when we talk about a flight test like Ares 1X was. It's not human rated. We don't need all those factors of safety. We don't need all that redundancy that the standards and the requirements that we have from NASA, that those would require of a human spaceflight.